So the fact that I haven't seen a single other person talking about the fact that we just rediscovered a lost Magellan colony off the southern coast of South America should be a crime. The story of this colony and the way its inhabitants were abandoned and left for dead, and how the location was lost for over 400 years before being rediscovered just last month, should be the plot of a movie, and yet nobody is talking about this. It's literally the perfect discovery. It's so rare that you can have basically a treasure map that leads you directly to a lost site. And then on top of that, you find it exactly the way that it's described in the text from centuries earlier. So between 400 and 500 years ago, there was a frenzy to explore the new world that we now know as the Americas, to conquer land, acquire resources and riches, establish forts and colonies, and fuel them until they grew into full-blown cities. During this time period, millions upon millions of native people would die from disease and war, and many of the attempted European colonies would fail, either succumbing to the environment, being raided and burned to the ground by natives, dying from disease or famine, and often it was all of these things simultaneously. Many of these forts and colonies would be left to fend for themselves for extended periods of time, sometimes up to 1 to 2 years, meaning that when future ships returned, they would often find the colony had been abandoned long ago, or maybe even worse, the vast majority of the colonists had died from disease and starvation, and the colony had fallen into desolation. And so, hundreds of years later, the American continents, from the northernmost coast of North America to the southernmost coast of South America, lost colonies and forts dot the American landscape, hidden among the dense vegetation and buried beneath the centuries, just like ancient ruins. And just a couple of weeks ago, a team working off the southern coast of Chile found a 440-year-old Spanish coin exactly where the old text said that it would be. And when they found it, they realized they were standing right in the middle of the legendary lost colony of Magellan. My name is Luke Caverns, I'm an American explorer, and I come from a lineage of explorers who searched for lost Spanish treasure and ancient artifacts in the American Southwest dating back to the 1890s. And this is the American Wilds. I don't know if it's just me, but I love that sound. So, in the mid-1500s, the Spanish Empire was unquestionably the dominant global power. They were the most powerful, dangerous, and by far the wealthiest empire in the entire world. They controlled 80% of the world's silver production, which mostly came out of South America. And during this time, they imported over 20,000 tons of silver and over 200 tons of gold from the Americas back to Spain. Now, people always wonder and ask me where the lost city of El Dorado went. Well, some of it almost certainly got melted down into gold ingots and put on Spanish ships and sent back to Spain. That said, there are so many more lost cities hidden in the Amazon, but we'll get to that in another video. They controlled massive and important territories on 4 continents, all simultaneously in Central and South America, North America, Europe, and even Asia. By modern estimates, Spanish fleets of the 1500s were so wealthy that a single convoy moving from South America to Spain could be carrying with it over $1 billion in valuable goods. Again, just in a single convoy. And one of the most important regions that the Spanish Empire controlled was the Strait of Magellan. First successfully navigated in 1520 by Ferdinand Magellan himself, the Strait of Magellan is a series of narrow, winding channels along the southern coast of South America with very unpredictable and violent winds and rocky coasts that were notorious for pummeling ships into oblivion. And in fact, to this day, the Strait of Magellan is responsible for the destruction, the pummeling, and the sinking of at least 800 ships. So you know that feeling where Sunday night hits and your stomach just sinks knowing that you're going back to your day job on Monday? Well, I lived that. And it wasn't just a bad day job, it was the wrong path entirely. And I knew that I had to escape this silent dread that I was pushing myself through every single day. I felt like every day I was just wasting my time, and I remember driving home feeling like I'd not actually achieved anything and it was already 5 p.m. I was just wasting my life. And I knew that that wasn't a place that I was okay with living in for the rest of my life. And I eventually did get out of it, but it required me to take a leap and follow my passions, go get a degree in anthropology, and begin an entirely new course for my life. And years later, that leap of faith was the best decision I ever made. And if changing this course of life is something that you've also been daydreaming of, Southern New Hampshire University, today's video sponsor, exists for this exactly. SNHU is one of the largest accredited universities in the US, with some of the most affordable online tuition rates in the nation. There are no set class times so that you can keep working while building towards something better. You can even transfer up to 90 credits, which saves you some serious time and money. And their career services team is there to help you prepare for the job market once you're ready. I think what SNHU offers is pretty outstanding. Go to snhu.edu/Luke Caverns. Over 200 degree programs are waiting. Click the link in the description or on screen and finally become the person that you've been waiting to be. Thanks so much to SNHU for sponsoring this video. Now back to the show. But it's actually far more likely to be probably north of 1,000, as many ships who set through the Strait of Magellan had nobody expecting them on the other side, and so therefore nobody to record that they'd gone missing. So they just disappear into time and are lost from the historical record forever. Within several decades, Spain's navy had learned to successfully navigate the strait on a somewhat regular basis, but mostly left it alone as it was too slow and too treacherous to rely on it for trade. In fact, it was so dangerous that the Spanish much preferred to haul their mined silver and gold from Peru and Bolivia across the harsh landscape of the entire continent from the west coast all the way until they reached the east coast of South America, and then ship them across the Atlantic, or haul the wealth up to the Gulf Coast of Panama and then send it through the Caribbean across the Atlantic, rather than attempt to load goods onto ships on the Peruvian coast and then head back south through the Strait of Magellan and out into the Atlantic. And keep in mind, all of these trade routes are thousands and thousands of miles. And because Spain controlled the entirety of the Caribbean, Central, and South America, they had for themselves what was essentially a private slice of the Eastern Pacific Ocean along the west coast of the Americas. No other European navy had any means of entering the Pacific except through Spanish-controlled territories. And so the Spanish inhabitants of New Spain in the Americas were free to live, build enormous colonies, and rapidly expand the wealth of their territory while being perfectly defended by the fierce geography of South America's southern coast, as well as the fortified entry points between the east and west coast. Never was there in the world such an empire as that of Spain, which stretches from the rising sun to the setting. The power of Spain is such that it can make war in every sea and upon every land at once. At no point in a single day did the sun ever set on the Spanish Empire, and that's pretty hard to wrap your brain around. And with the Pacific coast of the Americas essentially cut off from all outsiders across the Atlantic, Spain was at the height of world power. That was until an English fleet of 5 ships, led by one of the most famous pirates of all time, Sir Francis Drake, plunged itself into the Strait of Magellan, successfully navigated its waters, and began raiding and decimating unsuspecting Spanish port colonies along the Pacific coast. A clear message to Spain that they were not untouchable. And I should probably do an entire video on the expeditions and the adventures of Sir Francis Drake, because there's so much more that I could get into right here. But these English raids on the Spanish colonies of the Pacific coast were like a proverbial shot heard around the world. The Spanish had the sudden and devastating realization that their private slice of the Pacific Ocean could now be invaded, and they'd done very little to prepare for it or even prevent it, just simply assuming that no other European country had the wealth, ability, or the balls to fund a voyage around the dangerous coast of South America. So Spain had to scramble. They sent hundreds of soldiers and colonists down to Chile's coast to build forts and colonies along strategic points in the Strait of Magellan to establish a permanent presence there. The plan was to build 2 colonies on either side of the strait. The first colony, Nombre de Jesus, and the second colony, Puerto del Hombre. These colonies were built to monitor and control passage around South America, to protect New Spain's southern front, assist Spanish ships traveling through the territory, and block or even wage war upon future enemy ships attempting to invade the strait, should that ever happen again. A Spaniard named Pedro Sarmiento de Gamboa was the architect of the second of the 2 colonies, Puerto del Hombre, which is the central focus of today's video and would later become famously known as Port Famine. So after the voyage down into the Strait of Magellan had barely survived the brutal conditions of partly crossing the strait, they finally began to build their colonies. Written records of the founding of the colonies survive, saying, "I placed the first stone of the church with my own hands, and beneath it I deposited a silver real de a ocho." which to us would be one Spanish coin. Now remember this coin because it's a central part of the story. Minted in Potosí as a sign of the possession and the beginning of this city in the name of His Majesty. It is a land of great mountains and very thick forest. The cold is so great that it seems to freeze the very breath in one's mouth. So these Spaniards were essentially cast out to this outpost on the farthest reaches of the Spanish Empire, exposed to the extreme cold and violent winds of Patagonia, living among poor, rocky, and acidic soils that made agriculture almost impossible even in the best seasons of the year. Let alone these Spaniards had no experience with cultivating agriculture in this area of South America and had no contact or friendly relationship with the natives that they knew must have been living somewhere in the region. There were almost no readily available plants to be foraged, and the hunting game was smaller and more rare than they'd anticipated. On top of that, fishing was abysmal in the harsh waters. Resupply ships were supposed to come on a semi-regular basis, but would either be canceled, delayed, or crashed up against the rocky cliffs and sunk on the way to the Magellan colonies. The Spaniards were stranded thousands of miles away from the nearest major Spanish cities in Peru, like Cusco. The resupply missions being sent to the colonies continued to be delayed, canceled, or just disappearing. Eventually, the governors in New Spain just quietly abandoned even attempting to support their Magellan colonies altogether, and left the colonists stranded more than 3,000 miles away on the edge of the planet in the harshest conditions imaginable. 3 years would go by before anyone arrived at the Magellan colonies again, and this time it was another Englishman, Thomas Cavendish. After navigating part of the passage, he saw the port off in the distance and approached it to find it had fallen into decay and ruin. It was a ghost colony. Something terrible had befell this place, leaving only a few Spaniards who were somehow still alive, living amongst the ruins of the colony. We came to the city of the Spaniards, which they had named the City of King Philip. The city had 4 bulwarks, which means forts, and in each bulwark a piece of ordnance, which means cannon. But the houses were all of wood, and the city itself was very ruinous. The Spaniards which were left alive in that place were but shadows of men. They were in such miserable case that they could not help themselves, but lived by the roots of the earth and such things as they could find. Ultimately, even though the English captain saw that these Spaniards were in desperate need of help and were really of no threat to him, he denied their pleas for help and left them stranded in the ruined colony to suffer the same fate as the other hundreds of Spaniards stationed at these colonies who died within the last several years. This is one of the most brutal reminders of the unbelievably and unimaginably harsh conditions of the age of exploration. Additionally, there was a Spaniard who was held captive and arrived by ships with the English to this colony, and he saw all of this with his own eyes. Years later, when he finally escaped English captivity, he gave an account of his entire experience. The English general Cavendish promised to take them all aboard after he had taken in water and wood further up the coast. But when he had finished his business, he spread his sails and stood out to the sea, leaving them upon the beach, crying out and making great lamentations. I saw them from the ship, kneeling on the sand and holding up their hands to heaven, begging for mercy that was denied to them by man. Cavendish left the starving and pleading handful of Spaniards to their fate in the abandoned colony and continued on. 3 years later, in 1590, another band of English ships arrived at the colony. We came to the place which the English call Port Famine, where we found the ruins of the city and only one Spaniard living, who was like a ghost of a man. He told us that after other ships, being Cavendish, had left them, his companions had died one by one of hunger and cold until he alone was left among the dead bodies of his friends. And it was beyond this point that this abandoned Spanish colony would forever become known as Port Famine. After 1590, the colony's location began to become forgotten, even eventually disappearing from some colonial maps altogether. The wooden frames of the buildings eventually collapsed under the violent winds, and the vegetation, like so many other ruins throughout the Americas, reclaimed the structures and buried them. By the 1800s, the coordinates of the colony began to drift across new maps, being inaccurately labeled, and Port Famine effectively became a ghost colony. And nobody was sure where the colony had really been founded. An excursion was sent out in the mid-1800s to find the location of the colony, but was unsuccessful. But just about a month ago, a survey team led by Soledad, González, Díaz, and Simon Urbina followed the 1500s diaries to get an approximate location of the lost colony. Once they'd found a rough coordinate that seemed to match the location described in the original sources, they ran LiDAR and GPR, which revealed several previously unknown geometric formations buried beneath the moss and vegetation. And one thing that stood out to them, among many others, was one particularly large rectangular formation, roughly about the size of a 1500 Spanish colonial chapel. So, an explorative archaeological team was sent in to investigate the site on foot. Once they had identified the geometric formations on foot, they began excavating the corners of what appeared to be an old building's stone foundation. After removing the mossy vegetation, they found a rectangular mason stone, and unbelievably, like something out of a movie, the silver Spanish coin that Gamboa had placed on top of the foundation stone over 400 years ago was still sitting right there. And immediately the team realized that they were standing right in the center of the ruins of the lost Spanish colony that had been abandoned over 400 years ago and forgotten. So now the team is expanding excavations, running extensive LiDAR and 3D scans of the site and the artifacts found within it to eventually virtually reconstruct the entire colony itself. 3D image scanning and LiDAR is the future of archaeology and exploration. People often like to say that the age of exploration ended in the age of exploration, but with new technological advances like this that are constantly progressing and becoming more affordable, that's just the furthest thing from the truth. This is going to open up so many more avenues for exploration that hadn't existed within the last 2 centuries alone. LiDAR and GPR are going to completely reignite archaeological exploration like never before. And in fact, I've got a LiDAR project that I'm starting here in the Americas just in the next couple months, but I'll tell you all more about that later. I'm Luke Caverns. Like and subscribe for more history of the American wilds, and I'll see you next time.